Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Matisow, the Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here tonight. This event is co-sponsored by the Baker Institute and by a Rice University program called Politics, Law, and Social Thought. The topic tonight is a topic in your program called The Rise of Populist Nationalism in Europe and the United States. A year ago, this topic was on the margin of public discourse. And then in the ensuing 12 months, it has moved into the riveting center of American attention. There are, of course, obvious reasons for that. There was the improbable candidacy of Donald Trump for President of the United States. There was the remarkable vote in June by the British electorate to withdraw from the European Union. There was a raft of articles connecting these events to similar events in Western Europe, the eruption in Western democracies of right-wing populist movements bearing much resemblance to the events in the United States and Britain. There has been a lot of good journalism on this. Tonight we are inviting members of the Rice faculty with expertise in these countries to try to deepen our understanding of what this is all about, because we don't really understand it yet. I could say that this event itself has a history. Those of us who put it together many weeks before the election never thought that Donald Trump would win it. On November the 8th, he won the presidency. 2 days later, we advertised this event. 2 weeks later, we had 600 responses, and we had to close down the registration. In the entire 23-year history of the Baker Institute, you are holding the hottest ticket. Many of you have been here before, and we're glad to have you here. But many of the people in the audience today are new to the Baker Institute, and I'd like to say to them that we put on here a remarkable number of first-class events dealing with issues of public policy and featuring experts from our faculty, from the Baker Institute, and from the larger world of public policy. And I invite you to go on our website and check on our events and come back. And I might also mention a way in which you can become part of the Baker Institute community. We have a support group called the Baker Institute Roundtable. You can belong to that, and it entails benefits, including, I've lost them. You ready for this? Invitations to a minimum of 12 Baker Institute member events with national and international leaders and dignitaries. 12 events, right? Invitation to annual members-only fall reception featuring Baker Institute fellows and scholars. Free Baker Institute policy reports and the Institute's annual report. An opportunity to meet people like yourselves with serious interest in public policy and to exchange ideas with them. And best of all, free parking. What's going to happen here tonight is this. Each of our scholars will talk about areas of their expertise, about 15 minutes each. After that, we'll have a question and answer period. There are cards at the seats of each of you. If you have a question, fill them out. Our staff will collect them, and we'll try to answer them, as many of them as we can. So we're going to begin, and our first speaker is Carl Caldwell, who's a member of the history department, a colleague of mine, and a distinguished historian. expert on European history with a special emphasis on Germany, and I am as interested in what he's going to have to say as you are. His topic is right-wing populism and the crisis of the EU. Carl?
Thank you, Alan, and I appreciate all of you coming out tonight. I have a problem with a microphone. I teach classes. The students say I'm like a praying tiger, and they also say I yell. If I get too loud, do this or something, okay? I'll try very hard not to yell at you. We've all heard the descriptions of Donald Trump as a right-wing populist. That term is not completely clear, but we have to have some kind of term because Trump is not alone. There are right-wing populist authoritarian leaders who are rising across the world, also surprisingly in Western Europe. Across the Western European states, there's a similar language of outrage being raised against elites, against minorities, against the rule of law, and for more authoritarian rule. Populist movements, some more leftish, some more rightish, have not just arisen, but they've shown remarkable staying power in the major states that formed the heart of the European community after 1949. And their main target within Europe is becoming the European community itself. Now today what I would like to do is to begin with some kind of general definition of what populism is, then give you kind of a rationale for why the European Union actually exists, and finally talk about how populism poses a crisis to the EU. So that's my agenda, also to introduce the panel in a certain way. So let's start with populism. One problem with the word populism is that it's so close to democracy. It means rule by the people. And Christian, at the end, will talk a little more about this, the proximity between the two. Nonetheless, you can feel that there's some kind of difference. Like the fascists of the 1920s, the right-wing populists invoke democracy in ways that have a decidedly anti- or undemocratic ring. Four aspects of populism are important for us tonight. First, there is an appeal to the people over against the government. The government has become alien, it rules over the people. And government here, interestingly, involves also representatives elected by the people. Second, by implication, there's a notion that the real nation should be in charge, not those representatives. That's often associated with a call to exclude minorities from basic rights, scapegoating, even attacking them. A third component of populism involves conspiracy theories. Because after all, I mean, if the people really knows what it's doing, how are they led astray? There you get to these theories about how the press systematically lies. It's all a big conspiracy. And finally, violence is often involved, either really or as a threat. For example, threatening not to accept the results of election if it doesn't go the way the people want. The threat to jail opponents, we have to say, is also part of this logic. Now, these are present in different degrees in different countries. They're all part of a general rhetoric of the people against the machine. And I would add, you also see them in normal democratic situations where people can get quite angry, right? Something else, however, I think is happening right now with these new populist movements in Europe. Now let's turn to Europe and ask why Europe? Why is the European Union becoming an issue? At the heart of the populist movement in Europe has been a criticism of the European Union, a criticism of Brussels, which is actually very familiar to us. It sounds a lot like a criticism of Washington. The European community formed after World War II. The key actors involved, especially the French, did not intend it to diminish national power. That's not why they formed it. They intended the European community to strengthen small and medium-sized nations in the era of the Cold War. And how to do this? First, by eliminating the possibility of war developing in Western Europe again. 4 major wars between France and Germany, starting with 1792. Second, to provide a united front against the Soviets during the Cold War. That involved not just military, but also economics, culture, and politics. And third, ever more important, from the 1970s on, to provide a unified economic zone in an era of increasing competition and markets on a global scale. So this is what the EU was about. Every significant expansion of the European power, central power, has been challenged. Everyone has been controversial. Some, like the failed constitution, have not gone ahead. But the general trajectory has been, since the 1950s, for more central government. Not because of a conspiracy, but because larger institutions have been better able to cope with the problems like how to create efficient markets in an age of globalization, how to fight international terrorism, how to deal with environmental problems. You know, a small state has a lot of trouble dealing with environmental problems simply because of the states around it. Okay, so that's the logic for the EU. Not surprisingly, as I said, there have been lots of critics of the expansion of European power. But in recent years, and especially after 2008, the parties that have been critical of the EU have been gaining traction. They have moved from being marginal governments to actually affecting, even defining the governments in the parliamentary systems in Western Europe. Main example here has got to be the British referendum to leave the European Union. And I want to step back a little bit, not to talk about the actual details of the referendum, but the formal constitutional logic that was involved. Britain has a system based on the sovereignty of the elected parliament, right? But Brexit had nothing to do with Parliament. It was a referendum. It was a vote by the people directly. It's a classic way of voting us versus them. And that's actually the way the logic of Brexit was posed by its supporters. The consequences of the vote were obscure. Warnings against it came from those who knew how the vote would affect specific policies, agriculture, atomic energy, and so on. These people were experts, hence them, the other. The people voted against the educated elites, apparently running the show. The voters voted against the Polish immigrants who were coming from the European Union to work in England. They voted against control by a Europe which they themselves had helped to create. What did they vote for? That's a very interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it. Certainly they voted for an image of a different country, a greater country, a country where the future was brighter, where England belonged to the English. Here's the key, the formal key. They voted as a people, not as a party. The parties are, according to populist logic, hopelessly compromised. The criticism of Europe quickly becomes a criticism of political parties, of party democracy. This populist critique, in other words, against the EU has a knock-on effect within the individual nation states. Thus, the Front National, the National Front in France, is a front, not a party. A front representing the nation. The alternative for Germany is not a party, it's an alternative. For what? For Germany. The exception proves the rule. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom in the Netherlands combines its attacks on Muslims and attacks on the EU with an attack on the party system in the Netherlands. Now, why has the EU become such a focus of ire in the last few years? I'm going to talk about two crises in particular, right? The financial crisis after 2008, which is by no means resolved, and the immigrant crisis, really the refugee crisis after 2014, 2015. And here's the detailed part of the show, so this is where we all have to try and stay awake, okay? Since the Eurozone nations shared a single currency and a single central bank, policy responses to the crisis of 2008 had to be shared. Now, step back for a minute. The European Union encompasses about 500 million people. The Eurozone, where they use the euro as currency, about 340 million people. So it's a bit larger than the United States in terms of population. This requirement of sharing policy responses created an opening for critics interested in dividing undemocratic Europe from the democratic nation. It provided an opening for populism. All of the countries that suffered from ongoing weakness in the crisis, think about Spain, Portugal, Italy, saw the rise of populist parties. The Greek case was exceptional. And here's where the politics come in. There was an initial bailout, but conditions continued to not improve in Greece. The three institutions involved in the bailout, that was the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, set conditions for Greece to receive more funds. They demanded austerity measures. In other words, think about the logic. External powers, even though Greece was part of the EU, external powers demanded that a democratic legislature take certain actions to receive money. And we always have to keep in the background how much, in the back of our minds, how much people were suffering in Greece at the time. 2012 or so, we're talking about 50% or more youth unemployment in Greece, and really a sense of no future on the part of a lot of people. The economic context is really important to this story. The Greeks responded by punishing the existing parties. New populist parties emerged on both left and right against the old parties. As they came to power, they shifted their criticism from the old parties to the European Union and to Germany. It was a very interesting moment when they shifted. And the top three parties, I believe in the beginning of 2015, elections of 2015, all three of them are populist parties of one kind or another. The left-wing populist Syriza Party's Minister of Economics found the source of the source of Greece's economic problems not in its own economy or regulation, but in Germany, especially in the Nazi occupation during World War II. That party and its right-wing populist coalition partner fanned protests against Germany and against Germans. The Nazis were to blame. In Germany, you see the reverse. As part of the EU crisis, the Alternative for Germany forms the first right-wing populist party to have a chance at national success in the history of post-war Germany. It forms in opposition to a Europe that they claimed forced German citizens to bail out lazy and corrupt Greeks. In other words, the populist attack on the EU in Germany was the exact reverse of the one in Greece, but with the same logic. A, if it potentially hurts, the EU does not represent the people. B, the other nation becomes a scapegoat for your nation's problems. Okay, that's setting a framework for then the next crisis, which really hits in 2015, the immigration crisis. And the immigration crisis overshadows the financial one. It follows, however, a similar institutional logic. The massive refugee movement from the civil wars in the Middle East threatened to overwhelm EU states. In fall 2015, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, responded to this reality by suspending an EU regulation that had already ceased to be real in the face of this movement of millions. This is a rule which required refugees to stay in the first country of the EU they entered. Had that remained in place, the border countries, Italy, Croatia, Greece, would have been overwhelmed. Merkel made this decision as the first step of finding a European solution to the problem. I want to stress here, because I think it's not always made clear in the press, this was not a sentimental response, this was not an emotional or capricious response. It was an attempt to ease pressure and then to find a European solution to the European crisis. And it inevitably involved sharing out asylum seekers across Europe. That meant accepting more Muslims into European countries. Right-wing populists painted the German action as an attempt to force their countries to take unwanted aliens as threats, especially in Poland and Hungary. In Austria, the Freedom Party has been knocking at the doors of power, making use of the same rhetoric. The refugee crisis is, of course, the background for Brexit and for the rise in popularity of the anti-EU, anti-Islamic Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. And in this context, we see, over the course of 2015 and 2016, the transformation of the Alternative for Germany into a major force, led by a well-spoken woman who defends the use of Nazi words like Völkisch, which means kind of ethnic, racial identity, allows other Alternative for Germany leaders to maintain contact with far-right groups, like the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, or the National Democrats, which is a group that referred to the election of Barack Obama as an alliance between Jews and Negroes. Political life has become nastier and more racist. And we'll hear more details about this from Julie in her comments in a few minutes. Taboos against racism in politics, present since World War II, are breaking down. But notably, outside of former state socialist countries like Croatia, Poland, and Hungary, none of the populist movements have come to power yet. And there's a difference there. Those three countries have a presidential system, and Mark will talk about the difference between presidential and parliamentary systems, I believe, in his comments. It's interesting, the US example, Donald Trump's election, offered hope to the right-wing populist parties, and to a man they praised it. Now, I want to be clear here. The arrival of refugees from the civil wars in the Middle East, combined with acts of terrorism, has increased fears among the people, and those fears are well-founded. It's also the case that the so-called elites, that is, elected representatives and experts, are seeking to find a real solution to the problem. Both can be true. that the people fear the future and just trust the experts, and the experts seek in good faith to solve problems but are unable to remove the sources of people's fear. That's what a real tragedy is all about. I'm coming to an end.
Oh, keep going.
Populism in Europe has the ability to pull the European Union apart. It actually is a threat. It challenges the principles developed by Christian democracy and social democracy upon which post-war Western Europe was built. Pluralist democracy, the legitimate role of parties in politics, civil rights, European cooperation. It's hard to see what would replace it. I sincerely doubt whether a disunified Europe could provide a framework for lasting peace, a framework for economic efficiency, global competition, most importantly, a framework for some kind of freedom and self-rule by small and medium-sized states. In short, to conclude, a populist revolt across the EU seeking a strong man to carry out strong politics for the individual nation would have, should it succeed, the opposite result of what it intends. Thank you.
The next speaker is Julie Fetty, who's a professor in the French Studies Department, and her title is Populist Nationalism in France.
Thank you, Alan. For 30 years, the populist nationalist extreme right party, the Front National, or the National Front, has been a continuous presence in French politics. It is no longer considered an aberration by anyone, as some of us might like to think of what recently happened in the United States. As of spring 2016, the National Front holds these elected positions. There's one National Front deputy in the French National Assembly, 2 senators, 22 National Front deputies in the European Parliament, over 300 regional elected councillors, as well as about 60 department councillors, and 27 mayors of French cities. So even though the Front National, the National Front, has never achieved more than 30% in elections, 30% is a lot. And Marine Le Pen, its current president, is running in the presidential elections in spring 2017. Most political experts believe that her candidacy will overturn the standard procedure of the French multi-party two-round election system, which typically eliminates marginal parties and sets the mainstream left and right head-to-head in the second round. Instead, in 2017, it is expected that Marine Le Pen will make it to the second round. So France will have a nearly unprecedented presidential face-off between a candidate from the right and a candidate from the extreme right. And because of recent votes in Britain and the United States, the impossible suddenly seems possible in France. Might she win the presidential? Well, the National Front has been responding for many years very effectively to changing circumstances and its growing electorate. It's starting to feel like France is really a three-party system. We could say that the conditions are ripe, as Carl has outlined, the 2008 recession, the 2014 to 16 refugee crisis. These conditions still exist in France, plus Brexit, plus Donald Trump, and I would add 3 more factors that might lead to a favorable outcome for a Le Pen victory. First, there's a major difference in what's going on in politics in France and the United States. There's a complete disintegration of the left in France. The socialist president, François Hollande, is hugely unpopular. There's no clear candidate. It wasn't the case in the United States. Second, the fact that François Fillon was just elected through the right-wing primary to be the mainstream right candidate, he won on a platform of streamlining the bureaucracy and streamlining labor protections. So this means actually that the National Front, with its form of welfare chauvinism and protectionist economic platforms, can actually appeal more to the leftist electorate than the mainstream right candidate will. And finally, I would say that the National Front has successfully, in quotes, exploited the 3 terrorist attacks that occurred in 2015 and 16 to its own ends. So there's a lot at stake. And in this talk, I'll cover a very brief history of the National Front, how it became what it is, a current snapshot. I'll do a comparison between Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump, and I'll also look at how the National Front might align with some of the outlines of populist nationalism that Carl drew. So, just to be clear, there's a much longer history of extreme right populist nationalism in France than just the National Front and the Le Pen family. And we can go back as far as the anti-Dreyfusard groups of the late 19th century through Vichy collaborators. But something special happened in the 1970s. We might look at that like a moment of fracture for French history. We have France really just basically digesting the end of colonialism in the 70s. We have the end in the mid-70s of what's called the 30 glorious years of post-war economic growth, and in the mid-70s, French entry into the worldwide recession due to the oil crisis. The 70s thus brings immigration forward as an important socioeconomic and political issue because it's linked with the economy and with unemployment in the 70s, and it becomes a touchstone of National Front ideology. And going on also in the 70s is a merging of extreme right groups into the National Front under the leadership of Jean-Marie Le Pen. And so the National Front encountered a couple of electoral successes in the 1980s. The first that took France by surprise was the 1983 control of the town of Dreux, which was quickly followed 3 years later by a quite shocking success in the legislative elections, whereby 35 National Front deputies made it to the French National Assembly. And that was because of a change in electoral procedure that was quickly undone after that. So in the 80s and the 90s, we see a growth and consolidation in this party, just as it also becomes a kind of untouchable in French political life due to Jean-Marie Le Pen's outrageous and racist and anti-Semitic remarks, for some of which landed him with convictions and periods of ineligibility. In the 2000s, we have a power struggle to succeed Jean-Marie Le Pen, and his daughter Marine emerges in 2011 as the president of the National Front Party. Nothing much has changed, especially in the recent decades, of either the adherence to the National Front or to their main mission. But what has changed under Marine Le Pen is a slight turn in strategy. But the mission is still anti-immigration, anti-European Union, anti-Islam, and pro-French sovereignty. But this little change in strategy is very significant. It's a strategy of normalization, or what is called in French de-demonization. She's actively tried to move the National Front from a radical or extreme party to a regular party. And by doing so, she's substituted crass racism with discourses more along the lines of secularism and sovereignty, which really both are codes for anti-Muslim and anti-immigration sentiment. But even if she has softened her tone, her principles are the same and have really been for the National Front. That is the idea of France as a nation that is rotting from within due to immigration, a nation that is threatened from without by Europeanization, and a nation that has been betrayed by France's own leaders. And now, we must not make too much of this de-demonization because it's really a strategy only exercised at the top of the party, not among National Front sympathizers or party members. There was a recent study, a 2015 analysis of an annual poll done by a respected French body, found that 4 out of 5 National Front sympathizers categorize themselves as racists, and 50% admit to anti-Semitic sentiment and Islamophobia, much higher rates than the rest of the population. So, I just wanted to say a few things about the main political platform of the National Front. Two main approaches: immigration and national sovereignty. So immigration has always been there since the 70s. And one of the National Front statements is, quote, "Assimilation is no longer possible with mass immigration." And that's really an extraordinary statement, to claim that newcomers in any nation are just simply unassimilable. Some of their proposals about immigration on their political platform today include dramatically reducing the rights of asylum, undoing the Schengen Accords, reducing the French green card from 10 to 3 years, expelling foreigners who have been unemployed for a year or more, criminalizing charity offered to illegal immigrants, and making anti-French racism a hate crime. Regarding Islam, I'll just quote something from the National Front political platform. Here's the quote. "Under Islamist pressure, businesses now only offer clients halal meat. Pork is no longer served in school cafeterias. Public pools impose same-sex swimming times. In hospitals, male medical personnel have trouble treating female patients. Religious practitioners invade public spaces to pray in total illegality," end quote. So here we have a compendium of dangerous threats to the French way of life. The Front National platforms on immigration and Islam go hand in hand with a strong law and order platform. Subtly or not so subtly, the National Front equates delinquency with foreign influence, and they amalgamate terrorism with Islam. In terms of French national sovereignty, it's a very big theme for the National Front. For example, the European Union is vilified for encroaching on national sovereignty both politically and economically. The National Front proposes a renegotiation of all treaties with the EU. They want out of the euro currency, and they pledge to hold a referendum on a Frexit if they are elected. And the same can be said for NATO, free trade, and globalization in general. They are all phenomena that are blamed for a loss of French sovereignty or Frenchness. All of this for the National Front requires a big state, a strong central state, to make this kind of national sovereignty come into being. And such a large, strong state also features in the National Front's platform on the economy, a strong state needed for a protectionist economy and to protect the welfare system that should be reserved just for the French. Let me just contrast Marine Le Pen with Donald Trump. She was the first French politician to congratulate Donald Trump, and her press conference celebrated his victory with this proclamation, quote, "This is not the end of the world, but the end of a world," end quote. And the National Front message has been, since the last few weeks, since the United States elected a populist, protectionist, nationalist leader, so can France. In terms of odious statements and general scandalousness, Donald can be more compared with Jean-Marie Le Pen, whom Marine expelled from the party, in fact, for such statements and general untouchability. But compared to Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen suddenly looks very sensible in France. She's also not an outsider like Donald Trump, but a career politician with family members sprinkled throughout the party. She has her own party. And we could almost say that Donald Trump was a third-party candidate on the GOP ticket. And one other difference is that while in the United States, Democrats and Republicans are noted for being more and more polarized over time, the National Front charges that the mainstream left and right parties in France are just exactly the same. They're both Eurocrats and neoliberals, and there's no distinguishable difference between them. Just to respond to some of Carl's outlaying of issues, is the National Front anti-democratic? I'll just read a statement that they make of themselves about democracy. I'll quote, "Democracy is a fundamental principle of the French Republic." So here it's affirmed, etc. However, and I'm still quoting, "However, it appears that democratic functions of our republic are gravely hobbled by our submission to the non-democratic European authorities and hobbled by the drift away from the defense of the general interest to particular interests." And that's a reference to minority rights. And I'll finish the quote. "A veritable democratic turnaround is needed for our republic." So I'm not sure if anti-democratic sentiment is directed at the state itself. It's certainly directed at the EU, also at the party system. But it's not directed at the French state. There's definitely an interest in the National Front, an emphasis on the French state and the French nation, less so on the French democracy. What about the National Front and this concept of France as a real nation? Well, yes, most definitely. Marine Le Pen's recent speech at Fréjus, opening the political season, referred to France as a homogeneous and fixed nation with people's connection based on culture and language. She says, quote, "Yes to multiculturalism on a global level, no to multiculturalism within any single country." So if that's not white nationalism, I'm not sure what it is. Like Donald Trump, the Front National supporters long for the good old days, back to when we were great / back to when we were white. I'm not so sure about violence, but in terms of conspiracy, yes, there's a constant fear of fomenting of crisis in National Front rhetoric. Marine Le Pen portrayed the upcoming presidential election as nothing less than the choice between the saving of sovereign France on the one hand, or the becoming of a nation that we no longer recognize. In other words, for electors, it's either the National Front or imminent chaos. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I don't think, personally, that France and the US in 2016 are at risk of fascism, because although Donald Trump and the National Front are right-wing populists, nationalists, and racists, they are not yet explicitly against the democratic system, and they have no territorial ambitions. But what does worry me gravely is the willingness of so many voters to overlook racism and misogyny on this side of the Atlantic to achieve other ends. Disgraceful statements were thought to be disqualifying, but no. For those who find racism abhorrent, there are no easy explanations. While electors' concerns for their own well-being are genuine, democracies cannot abide political leaders who exploit these concerns through the instruments of racism. Even if the National Front looks like a legitimate political party, it's still an extreme right populist group that promotes a French form of white nationalism. The world, in my opinion, now really needs a European Union more than ever, if the United States might turn its back on democratic values of internationalism and inclusiveness. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mark Jones, a professor of political science, and his subject is Presidentialism, Populism, and President-elect Trump.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Here at the Baker Institute and at Rice, I wear two hats. I study American politics with a special focus on Texas, and I study Latin American politics with a special focus on Argentina. Normally, when I'm talking about populism, in the past, it's been focusing on Juan Perón, or Carlos Menem, or Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, or Alberto Fujimori in Peru, Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But in recent months, with the election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States, we're talking about populism here in the United States. Now, this is a topic that in our Master of Global Affairs program, where many of my students are here, and I'll be teaching a course on this in the spring, we could devote a lot of time to it. I'm going to try to boil it down to about 10 or 12 minutes. Populism has a long history in the United States. We can go all the way back to Andrew Jackson as an ardent populist about 200 years ago. And there was a strong populist movement, even forming a third party. The populists were very popular here in Texas, Kansas. If you're ever in Lampasas and go north there about 3 or 4 miles, there's a little historical marker. That's sort of the seeds of the populist movement in the United States, a farm alliance that was founded there. I like historical markers. My wife, not so much, but I still stop. In terms of modern populism, we can go back to, say, 1968 as sort of a pivotal year. Then Alabama Governor George Wallace, an ardent segregationist, ran as the candidate of his own party, the American Independent Party, and won 5 states through the Deep South, as well as 21 counties here in Texas, including Montgomery County and Chambers County. Now, Montgomery County of today is a very different county. Chambers County, not so much, but it was a different era. But one of the downsides that Wallace had was that he wasn't running as a Democrat. When he tried, he got shot a few years later. And he wasn't running as a Republican. Fast forward to 1992, we had another populist run. Ross Perot also ran as an independent. He captured more of the vote than Wallace. Wallace had won 14%, Perot captured 19%. But since Perot's support was distributed across the entire country, he didn't capture any electors, though he did cost George H.W. Bush the presidency, most likely. Now, a difference between Donald Trump and Wallace and Perot is that he actually went through the main party system. Now, in his first foray into politics back in 2000, he toyed with the idea of running as the Reform Party candidate, which was a party that Ross Perot had effectively created by getting ballot status in his '96 campaign. But Trump decided that that wouldn't be realistic because it was impossible to win as a third-party candidate. Now, in 2016, or back in 2015, he decided that the best route and the most viable route was via the Republican Party. And he did so at a time when conditions were very ripe for his type of populist candidacy. The Republican Party, if we're thinking about the internal part of the party, the people who participate in Republican primaries, had been held together between its establishment and sort of more movement conservative wing by some promises related to social policy, support for Second Amendment rights. But there was a bargain whereby the base supported the elite in exchange for their both support for social policy, but also for the desire to get things done in Washington, to change things. And since the rise of the Tea Party movement, that base had been looking at their leaders in Washington, the people they kept sending back, and they said, well, you aren't having much success. It seems like the same old Washington. At the same time, part of the bargain was falling apart. That is, the base never really cared too much about free trade. They were somewhat skeptical of it. And they weren't very supportive also of the elite's relatively flexible or pragmatic immigration policy. There was always tension there, but it was papered over. What Donald Trump did was effectively punched right through it. Ted Cruz also recognized this, that there was this option there. And I think Ted Cruz, probably sitting back, can't realize how Donald Trump outflanked him. That is, how Donald Trump became more of an outsider, how Donald Trump took advantage of this rift in the Republican Party and succeeded where Ted Cruz failed, though Cruz came very close. So Trump was able to take advantage of this rift in the Republican Party, and he was also able to bring new voters into the fold. That is, people who hadn't previously participated in Republican primary politics, and get them to vote. That was combined with his ability and willingness to go further than any of his colleagues. And that was in terms of using inflammatory rhetoric, in terms of using offensive rhetoric, in terms of making outlandish statements, in terms of contradicting himself. He was willing to do everything, and he succeeded. And he was able to effectively manipulate the media in a way that no other candidate could. Throughout the primary season, Donald Trump received double the coverage of any of his rivals in the Republican primary. And he received more positive coverage than they did, often completely unfiltered. He would receive essentially open mics and talk, however he wanted to, when he wanted to. As a result, this use of the media as well as social media allowed Trump to remain in the lead throughout the latter part of the pre-campaign and into the primary season. Now, that was all within a context where there were over a dozen credible rivals facing Trump, many of whom were dividing the same share of the vote. And if we look at sort of the establishment wing or the more moderate wing of the party, people like Marco Rubio, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, and Chris Christie, they were effectively dividing up all of the same voters. And at the same time, the same donors. Jeb Bush and his supporters and Mike Murphy, his chief consultant, effectively burned $100 million for no real impact other than maybe to tarnish Marco Rubio and make it more difficult for Rubio to defeat Trump once Bush had gone to the wayside. And that allowed Trump to effectively go into the Republican primaries and win majorities of the delegates, because the Republican primaries are relatively majoritarian in how they allocate delegates, unlike the Democratic Party. And with about a third of the vote through Super Tuesday, win a majority of the actual delegates. And that's when we step back. Donald Trump was only winning about a third of the Republican primary vote throughout the entire time, as long as there were a reasonable number of candidates. And in the end, only about 1 in 20 American adults voted for Donald Trump in the Republican primary. But that was key. That was the key first step in his election, that is capturing the Republican nomination. Because once you capture the Republican nomination, you're one of two people who's going to be the next president of the United States in our system. That's the way it is. And so Trump was set up as in competition between him and the Democratic nominee, who was Hillary Clinton. Now, Trump was by far and away the most unpopular and disliked presidential candidate in modern American history. About 2/3 of Americans hold a negative view or held a negative view during the electoral season of Donald Trump. He had the good fortune, though, to run against the second most unpopular person in modern US history, Hillary Clinton, who about 55% of Americans had a very negative or unpopular view of. That combined with an era where Hillary Clinton had the deck somewhat stacked against her. It's very rare for someone of the same party to win 3 elections in a row. So for essentially Barack Obama served 8 years, 2 elections. For Hillary Clinton to win a 3rd election, that feat has only been accomplished once since Harry Truman. That's when George H.W. Bush won in 1988, and that was with the help of James Baker. And so Hillary Clinton didn't have that. So that and then Hillary Clinton was also in an era where there was a real hungering by many voters for change and a real distaste with the elite. Hillary Clinton was the consummate insider, someone who's been involved in national politics for more than 3 decades. And so for many voters, I think, and this is important when we're trying to think in terms of the broader American democracy for the impact of Donald Trump and what it means, you have to remember that voters were effectively given 2 choices. Hillary Clinton, who was a flawed candidate, and Donald Trump as a flawed candidate. And in the end, about 1/4 of Americans chose Donald Trump. That was the choice. Now, how did Trump win this election? Well, when we look at the popular vote, he actually lost it. Okay, so Hillary Clinton won 48% of the popular vote. Donald Trump won 46%. In the end, he won 65 million. He won 63 million. But his vote was far better allocated, especially across some key battleground states. Although if you flipped 250,000 votes, Donald Trump would have lost the election. And it's about how many people voted in Fort Bend County. Flip those votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. It's about 220,000 altogether, and Hillary Clinton is president of the United States. But the reality is, under the Electoral College, Trump's votes, and those extra votes Hillary Clinton won in California, or the extra votes she won here in Texas, are irrelevant. And that's just the way the game is played. It's like time of possession in football. If we based victories on time of possession, Rice would be 8-4, not 3-9. We're good at time of possession. So in terms of the support that Trump had, if we compare it to Mitt Romney, it was very similar. His support among the Anglos was almost identical. He lost Anglos with college degrees a little more, so that group defected from him somewhat, but he gained among Anglos without college degrees. So they pretty much maxed out, or they pretty much canceled out each other. And the advantage for Trump was he lost college-educated Anglos in, say, New York or in the major cities. He won non-college educated Anglos in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, in these key battleground states. That was really critical for him. He also, contrary to expectations, retained most of the Anglo-female vote. That is, there was a fear among Trump supporters that there was going to be a massive dash of many Republican women either for Hillary Clinton or not voting at all. And in the end, he only just did slightly worse than Mitt Romney did among Anglo women, and he made up for that and then some among Anglo men. And then finally, contrary to expectations, Trump did just as well among Latinos and Asian Americans as Mitt Romney did, winning about 30% of the Latino vote and 30% of the Asian American vote, and doing a little better than Romney among African Americans, although that has more to do with Barack Obama being not on the top of the ticket than anything else. But the point being that Donald Trump won between 25% and 30% of the minority vote, and that also helped to propel him to victory in places particularly like Florida. So in terms of what this means for U.S. democracy, Latin America is the one region where we have a combination of presidential systems as opposed to parliamentary systems. The presidential systems are more open to populist leaders and also can create some unique challenges. And if we look at Latin America and we sort of say, okay, what do the lessons from Latin America among populists tell us, it leads us to expect three possible scenarios, or three things to watch out for. The first is that we could see heightened conflict and an erosion of checks and balances. That is, populist presidents don't like to be constrained by Congress, they don't like to be constrained by the courts, they don't like to be constrained by bureaucracies, and they're likely to break norms, unwritten norms, even and written laws. So there's likely to be constant and heightened friction between the president and Congress. And that includes both Democrats as well as Republicans, because it's likely that Trump at some point over the next few years of his presidency is going to begin to create friction with many conservatives, or on either side. He's either going to go too far to the right on some issues, alienating pragmatic establishment conservatives, say on issues like trade, or he's likely to go too far to the center on issues like same-sex marriage or transgender access to bathrooms, which is a major issue for some on the right. So those are all issues where Trump may alienate even some of his Republican colleagues, let alone to Democrats. There's also likely to be some friction with the press. That is, populist leaders don't accept the press, our freedom of the press as given, and you're likely to see a lot of attacks on the press, and the president fighting back, or Trump fighting back against the press in terms of negative coverage, either with direct attacks via social media or the bully pulpit of the presidency, or indirect attacks in terms of signaling potential problems that the media may have with in its interaction with the government. And finally, there's always the risk, although this is, I think, less the case in the United States, given the strength of our democratic system, of an erosion of civil liberties, which is always something to keep an eye on. But the jury's still out. Donald Trump hasn't even assumed office. That's still a month or almost 2 months away. So we'll have to wait and see how this all evolves. Thank you.
I remind you that you have cards at your seats, and if you'd like to write out a question, I guess this is your last chance. And the next speaker is Christian Emden, a professor of German intellectual history and political thought. And his topic today is why constitutional democracy cannot avoid populist nationalism.
And that's probably a very depressing end to this panel. I want to change gears a little bit and at the end, of course, move a little bit more into the direction of political theory on the one hand, but on the other hand, I will draw on a lot of things that Carl, Julie, and Mark already said. So I have two tasks. One is to give a more fuller description of the overall characteristics of populist nationalism. And secondly, I want to focus a little bit on one of the underlying structural reasons why liberal, well-established liberal constitutional democracies that have traditionally been very good at defending themselves against external threats and authoritarianism, why they can fall into the trap of populist nationalism. And that has something to do with something that Karl already mentioned right at the beginning, which is a particular conception of the people, which itself is linked to a particular conception, or rather a confusion about what popular sovereignty is or is supposed to be. Of course, that also means that as the students, my students in the audience know already, I'm not going to offer any solutions. I'm just going to make things way more complicated than they already are. But I think at this time of the day, that's probably allowed. So in a nutshell, I'm going to argue that populist nationalism is historically as much as philosophically kind of the ugly sibling of constitutional democracy. It runs in its development parallel to constitutional democracy, at least since the 18th century. So what sets populist nationalism apart in many ways from comprehensive and very coherent authoritarian ideologies is that its appeal to popular sovereignty in a very peculiar way. So populist nationalism, and this is the overall thesis of what I'm going to say, is not simply a response to the effects of modernization or a critique of the effects of modernization. But the reason why populist nationalism is even possible in constitutional democracies is an effect of modernization itself. The logic of populist nationalism is, in a sense, written into the justification of constitutional democracy. And so, in a certain sense, we should be very much worried about the rise of populist nationalism recently across Europe and also on this side of the Atlantic. But democracy theorists are not entirely surprised about it either. Crucial here is that regardless as to which populist or populist nationalist movement you look at the moment, they all share one general characteristic, and that is an appeal to democracy and an appeal in particular to the power of the people, to popular sovereignty, and a particular conception of the people. It doesn't matter whether you look at the Five-Star Movement in Italy, for instance, which is not really a nationalist movement. You can look at the Dutch Freedom Party, which is a staunchly nationalist movement. The Alternative for Germany in Germany, they all share this basic principle. Of course, they also share very anti-democratic structures that I'm going to kind of outline in a moment. So let's have a look at some of the overall characteristics of populist nationalism. First of all, populist nationalism entails an absolutism in moral terms, about what politics is. It requires a moralization of the political argument. So that's very central to populist nationalism. Government and policy making in liberal democracies is ultimately morally gray and ethically gray, and there are always payoffs that you have to make and compromises that you have to enter into that you don't want to enter into. But basically, this is, of course, how democracies work. In the populist nationalist imagination, of course, that needs to be replaced by a very strict and clear-cut differentiation between what's right and what's wrong, between us and between them. And that translates, of course, into something that is, in moral terms, we are always good, i.e. the people, they, the others, regardless of whether those are minorities or whether that's a perceived cosmopolitan elite or the European Union, they're of course morally evil in a certain sense. So this moralistic understanding of politics is very crucial to populist nationalism. A moralization of politics, of course, works particularly well in terms of emotions and in terms of affects. So populist nationalism is in many ways connected to a politics of affects. Moral conviction cannot really be empirically disproven, right? Try to have an argument with someone who is completely morally convicted about his or her position. Rational argument and empirical evidence will not sway that particular person. And so the political style of populist nationalism is focused on affect precisely because it cannot be disproven, and it invites the kind of conspiracy theories that I'm going to get into in a moment, but that Karl already mentioned. Affect and emotions are, even though they are central ingredients of politics in all democracies, they're also a danger to constitutional democracy. And this leads me to the anti-democratic dimension of populist nationalism. Generally speaking, political debate in pluralist civil societies generally requires a balance between emotional attachment to a certain set of values on the one hand and giving reasons and rational deliberation on the other. Even most citizens who wholeheartedly subscribe to democracy, they do so not necessarily on the grounds of rational justification. They do so on the grounds of a vague commitment to the ideals of democracy. Freedom, for instance, equality, justice, some kind of ideal or value. What is interesting is that many of these values and ideals, even though the public cannot translate that into a rational justification, can actually be translated into a rational justification. Now, on the populist side, that is not necessary, that step. The claims of populist nationalism do not require any further justification, and they certainly don't require any rational justification. The consequence is that populist nationalism has, of course, an at best uneasy relationship to normal democratic procedures. And you can see that very clearly in the relationship between populist nationalist parties and democratic elections. Democratic procedures and democratic elections are tolerated if they support the populist cause. They are seen as rigged or conspiracy, as unfair, if they do not support a particular outcome that favors the populist party. And think about Trump's remarks after the third presidential debate, right? Not entirely willing, not entirely certain whether he's willing to accept the outcome of the election. Now, what is very crucial here is that from the perspective of populist nationalism, the nation and the people are, of course, always under threat and in crisis. And this situation that the nation is always under threat can only be overcome by a strong leader who somehow symbolically embodies the people. And think about statements that many populist nationalist politicians use. Silvio Berlusconi in Italy noted, "I am the Jesus Christ of politics. I sacrifice myself for everyone." I think Berlusconi and Jesus Christ is a pretty good combination, of course. Hugo Chavez noted, "I am not an individual, I am the people." And Donald Trump pointed out, I am representing many, many, many millions of people. Not their interests, but I'm representing them directly. In light of this, it's also important to point out, and both Carl and Julie pointed that out to some extent already, is that populist nationalism presents itself not as part of the normal party political machinery that makes up representative democracy, which is parties in the first place, but they're always movements. Right? The Front National, the National Front in France, describes itself as a movement, as a mouvement, even though legally speaking it has to be a party to take actually part in the elections. And the same is the case if you look at the Dutch Freedom Party, which has exactly one member, its leader, Geert Wilders. Everybody else who votes for the Dutch Freedom Party represents the people as a whole. On the other hand, this movement, of course, lacks any democratic features. The National Front in France, when you go to their website, it becomes very clear. It is described there as a movement presided over by Marine Le Pen. Right? A mouvement présidé par Marine Le Pen. There are no other leaders, there are no democratic structures, everything is subordinate to the leader of the movement. And of course, if there's too much disagreement, populist parties ultimately tend to exclude those who dissent. The Five-Star Movement in Italy is very successful at that. If one of their members dissents, they're simply excluded from the party without further debate. So the implication of this is, of course, that populist nationalism, especially when it is organized, inherently denies pluralism and supports exclusion. Because you want to be, well, if you're not part of the movement, of course, you're also not part of the people, which allows, in the rhetoric of populist nationalism, to exclude a large part of the population that officially are not real Americans, real French citizens, real Germans, real Dutch people. That is, of course, fundamentally anti-pluralist, and it also denies the complexity of the democratic societies within which we live. Now, these characteristics translate into a certain pattern. All populist nationalist movements follow this pattern. It doesn't matter whether you look at Germany or at France or at the US or at the UK Independent Party. They all roughly follow this pattern. Populist nationalists first identify a real failure within the existing society. It's a very concrete failure, say socioeconomic inequality or lack of social mobility. The crucial point, however, is that other parties do that as well. But other parties do not translate that into a far-reaching crisis by connecting that real failure to a broad range of other issues that are only tenuously, if at all, connected to that particular real failure. So suddenly lack of social mobility is connected to race, terrorism, immigration, abortion, who knows what it has to do with that. But it becomes basically a social imaginary that is being created here, and that, of course, can be amplified in particular through social media. The next step that is necessary in that context is precisely this moralization of the people that I've already hinted that is part of the amplified crisis message, which then requires, of course, that if there is a crisis, you need to find someone who's responsible for the crisis. And those are, of course, those representatives who do not belong to the real set of the people, not real Americans, not real French, not real Dutch, and so on. Connected to this is always, invariably, a set of relatively simple solutions, build a wall, and a strong personality, often a charismatic personality, although that's not necessary. The leader of the German Alternative for Germany, Frauke Petry, isn't exactly a charismatic leader, even though she's a very good public speaker. But that strong personality always presents him or herself as standing outside normal political and social traditions. But when you look at the leaders of the populist nationalist parties, that of course rarely is ever true. Le Pen, Wilders in Holland, Viktor Orban in Hungary, they all had very, very long party political careers. Trump, Christoph Blocher in Switzerland, Silvio Berlusconi, Frauke Petry, they belong to the business establishment in their respective countries. So they're not really outsiders, and they certainly don't represent the people in any proper sense of the term. So basically, here are three conditions that a populist nationalist movement need to meet. The first is a real failure, the second is a rhetoric of crisis, and the third is a moralization of the people. But these three can only come together in constitutional democracies because constitutional democracies, of course, are justified by appeals to popular sovereignty. And this is kind of presents an interesting impasse or an interesting dilemma for those who wish to confront populist nationalism. Think about the very difficult situation that Hillary Clinton found herself in relatively early on, well, not quite that early on, but in September, at the beginning of September, when she responded to Donald Trump by basically pointing out or noting that his supporters are a basket of deplorables. Whether or not that's true, that's not the point. The crucial point is that it will only enhance the moralization of the people, and it only will play into the hands of populist nationalism. And basically, I strongly believe that by September 9, she has lost the election, whatever the electoral data will say about that. But the other problem, of course, that you cannot counter populist nationalism with rational debate, since populist nationalism will always note that rational debate and rational argument is just a conspiracy of the cosmopolitan elites against the people, against the common man. So the impasse that many democratic and in Europe social democratic parties suddenly find themselves in is that on the one hand they cannot moralize politics, they cannot be as populist as the populists, but they also cannot become in many ways rational about the problem at hand. So what to do? I don't know what to do, and I'm going to leave that question open, of course, as my students know. But I want to at least point to one of the underlying structural reasons where this problem comes from and why this problem, in a certain sense, why we can't avoid this problem in a certain sense. Both populism and nationalism, historically as well as philosophically, belong to the tradition of democracy. It's not surprising that calls for popular sovereignty in the course of the second half of the 18th century run parallel to the development of European nationalism. It's a moment when the nation moves into the political imagination as a central political actor. The two are connected, of course, in many ways. And underlying this is a particular understanding of the people, because the people don't mean very much. It's simply an aggregate of individuals, but you need to translate the people and therefore also popular sovereignty into something more manageable, into something that has much clearer boundaries in a certain sense. You can appeal to class, you can appeal to race, to heritage, shared historical experience and the like, but ultimately you need to have something that's fairly concrete or seemingly concrete, and the nation fulfills that role. So popular sovereignty in the history of democracy, on the one hand, entails populism in the sense that the people seek emancipation from what is perceived to be an elite, monarchy for instance, that is seen as illegitimate. But popular sovereignty also entails nationalism, since the latter, nationalism, promises the realization of popular sovereignty within a very specific cultural context. There are different kinds of nationalism. We might be able to get into this in the discussion. Not all nationalism is necessarily exclusionary. There are different forms of nationalism as well. Now, political philosophers in the 18th and 19th century have realized that popular sovereignty presents a problem here. And sometimes they've been quite harsh about this problem. So the German philosopher Hegel, for instance, in the 1820s noted in response to this that the public needs to be both praised as well as despised. It needs to be praised because it actually raises interesting issues, but it needs to be despised because it remains purely on an emotional level and these issues remain unarticulated. And in a certain sense, if they're unarticulated, they can't be rationally justified, and that's a fundamental problem. Montesquieu saw this already in the middle of the 18th century. John Stuart Mill saw the problem in the middle of the 19th century. But under the conditions of modernity, of mass democracy proper, this becomes a more acute problem. And Max Weber points this out at the end of the First World War, or rather at the beginning of the Weimar Republic. In a certain sense, both parliamentary and presidential democracies face two threats. One from above, which is a tendency towards authoritarianism, and one from above, which he described as the lack of political maturity among the irrational democracy of the streets. Of course, he found very harsh words for that. And within this context, nationalism and identity politics of all kinds play a very important role. Now, after 1945, during the Cold War and in the immediate post-Cold War period, much political thought focused on authoritarianism in all its forms and guises as a main threat to democracy, forgetting to some extent how populist movements feed into authoritarianism and also have strong anti-egalitarian, anti-pluralist, and anti-democratic structures. So when you look at most kind of Northern Hemisphere philosophers, John Rawls in the US, Jürgen Habermas in Germany, they basically never looked at Latin America. How populism switches here from an emancipatory ideal to an authoritarian government. And in light of this, much traditional or mainstream political theory has underestimated the role that emotions play in politics, and also the way in which practical political reasoning in democracies by most citizens actually relies on nationalist categories, like the people, the national interest, and the like, because it's much more tangible in a certain sense. Now, the upshot here is that the voting public in many constitutional democracies, Europe, but as well as on this side of the Atlantic, does not always fully recognize that one function of constitutional democracy is to limit popular sovereignty for two reasons, both to guard against populism and to make complex administrative decisions possible, precisely the kind of technocratic administrative positions that Karl outlined with regard to the European Union, for instance. The interesting thing here is that those who vote for populist nationalism conflate the people and popular sovereignty with democratic government, but those are two different things. Recourse to the people is a form of justification. It justifies democracy, but democratic government is a technique, a very particular technique of making decisions under very specific constraints, and those constraints just don't play a role in the assertion of popular sovereignty at all. And we can just hope that Donald Trump and perhaps Marine Le Pen will realize that there are some constraints on what the populist nationalist leader can do. So this, of course, leads me to a somewhat depressing conclusion. And as my students know, this is always kind of the danger of the political realist. Kind of politics is tragedy in many ways. So the underlying conclusion here is certainly that populist nationalism cannot be avoided in constitutional democracies, but it might be possible to hold it at bay. And one way to hold it at bay is for democratic governments to take seriously and actually address some of the real failures that populist nationalism does indeed identify in order to gain broader appeal. Now, let me be clear about this. The real failure, for instance, is not too many immigrants or too many Muslims. The real failure is not enough socioeconomic mobility, too much socioeconomic inequality. That needs to be addressed, and it's only linked post factum to immigration and a whole range of other issues. But at the same time, constitutional democracies, and I think some have been particularly successful at that, some intentionally, like Germany, others perhaps a little bit more unintentionally, like Italy, is to create institutional hurdles to make the influence of populist nationalism more difficult. And that works better in parliamentary system than it does in presidential systems. And that's pretty much it. With this depressing note, I shall end.
Okay, we come to that part of the program when you in the audience have posed questions. I thank you for submitting your question. I should point out that one of the criterion of selection for the questions is whether I can read your handwriting. And that's not always easy. Here's a question. Are the concerns raised by various populist groups legitimate when it comes to the preservation of Western culture? Carl, what do you think?
That's a really interesting question. It's a hard one to answer. You have to ask what Western culture is. Mm-hmm. And very, very serious here. You know, it's not just that we at the university are elites and play around with concepts and are superficial. We've had a serious debate for 50 years about what Western culture is. We find it to be a lot of contradictory things, which is what Christian was talking about. If it's a bunch of contradictory things, then what are we defending? Let me give you an example. It has to do with religious freedom. This is a basic founding principle of the Republic, right? Religious freedom doesn't necessarily mean freedom for individuals in a religion, though, when it comes to real life. To what extent do we guarantee individuals the freedom also to escape a religion? To what extent do we limit religions which are limiting freedom? I'm not going to give you an answer to that. What I'm going to do is to say that within Western culture that we're trying to preserve is actually a set of problems that we have to work through. The populist answer says there is a threat. We have to respond to the threat. We have to push it away. My answer in my classroom, which is a little place where we play at democracy, right? In theory, is that we have to ask not only, for example, are there certain, there are threats. Some of the people coming into the country I don't think probably agree with their values. There's also similar issues within our own community. We have to find a way to balance interests and have a real sustained dialogue about where to draw lines. I know that sounds not very clear. That is the point. The only way to deal with this problem of the limits of religious freedom and the claim of individual rights is to figure out the hard way, case by case perhaps, through courts, where it is to be found. It's not by eliminating entire groups that we suspect of undermining our already contradictory culture. Is that okay?
Darn right.
He called on me. He's old enough to be a professor.
Anybody else on the panel who would like to comment on that question in particular? We have another one here. To what extent is Russia connected to the EU populist parties? What do these parties think of Putin?
So
Really?
The National Front would definitely favor a change from the European alliance of NATO, transatlantic connection to a kind of axis based around Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. But the National Front is not the only party that is open to Putin and a new way for Russia to play a role in French international relations. So, finish there.
The Alternative for Germany has recently called for the end of NATO. They really are looking at Putin as a model of someone to resist what they fear. Syriza in Greece, with the support of their partner, were talking about using Russia to get support in order to probably play a card against the Eurozone. I actually think it's playing a huge role as a model for different kind of politics, as a model of a way of breaking out of the EU, as a model also for breaking away from NATO.
Isn't the purpose of government to be responsive to the people? And if the people want to preserve their way of life, which America has always provided, what is wrong with that?
That's a philosophical question.
Yeah, you're the philosopher, Christian.
And I'm afraid I'm going to give the philosophical answer to that, of course. What the people is and what a particular way of life is undergoes change, of course, historically, and socially as well. So what does it mean to conserve or continue a particular way of life? There's no clear answer to that. Does it refer to something socially? Does it refer to economic conditions? Does it refer to the overall constitution of society? I think it's kind of unclear. Of course, all societies would like to continue one way or the other if they happen to be in a good position, their way of life. But they often also don't recognize that that way of life is far more fluid than they assume it to be, through demographic changes, but also through immigration, which is not inherently a bad thing. When you think about the effect that the refugee crisis, for instance, had on German society, it not only had a negative effect, but it also, in many ways, contributes to the economic situation in Germany and corrects some demographic trends that are problematic for Germany. And Germany is beginning slowly to realize or Germans begin to realize, to some extent, that their way of life needs to change precisely because they're now an immigrant country, an immigration destination, which hasn't been there before. So these kind of, the context within which one can ask that question, of course, constantly undergoes change, but there's nothing bad about that.
Here's a question for Julie and Mark, I think. How does anti-Semitism fit in with populist philosophy in France, and do you detect, Mark, any anti-Semitism in national populism in the United States?
I think it's more of a French issue. I'd say it's more of a French.
Okay. So the National Front was always anti-immigrant, but particularly anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism directed towards internal French Jews. It was a feature of Jean-Marie Le Pen's first famous remark when he brought up in 1983 his argument that the Holocaust was a mere detail of the World War II history. And after that, different anti-Semitic comments featured prominently in his discourse. But it's not just an isolated case, again, of such a leader. And so the Front National has really kind of cornered the market on anti-Semitism in France. What is changing a little bit now is that anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic acts and discourse have grown in a recorded fashion among some, not among the standard neo-Nazi skinhead National Front group, but on the contrary, among some French persons of North African origin. So it's a very different kind of anti-Semitism that also plays in with anti-Zionism. whether this is all a feature of populism. I do think that anti-Semitism and racism, though very different from each other, are critical features, perhaps not necessary, but critical features of populism that we see in France and that we see in other countries.
I think in the United States, with Trump's campaign, it was more on the tangential side. Since Trump received some support from the alt-right and accepted that support, but trying to keep it at arm's length, anti-Semitism boiled out of the alt-right, although you didn't see it by Trump or any of his top campaign officials, including, of course, his son-in-law.
Will the balance of power in our Constitution be a sufficient deterrent to an autocratic presidency? This has been touched on before, but to what extent, I guess, can we depend on the balance of power when all three branches are occupied by the same party and there's such a potentially strong president? Do we have enough protections if autocratic tendencies should appear? God help us.
Well, I think this will be a good test first of that. I have faith in the U.S. democratic system first and foremost. It's a long-established system. It has very strong Congress, arguably the strongest legislative branch in any presidential system, a very strong judicial branch, well-established institutions. And I wouldn't be as worried about the partisan makeup, because if there's likely to be any interbranch conflict, it will also involve Republicans against Donald Trump. That is, though I think what we're going to see is Donald Trump testing the boundaries of how much the president can do, as well as probably showing a willingness to break many of the norms that have existed. Now, that's the more negative side. On the positive side, we also are in an era of increasing polarization, where we have had the parties being so separated that nothing has gotten done. So if you wanted to look at a glass half full impression of Trump, that he may, because he's not part of the mainline party system, he may be more willing to work with Democrats as well as Republicans than we saw during, say, the Obama administration, where the separation between the president and Republicans in the legislature was so severe that effectively after 2010 nothing got done.
Why didn't Greece exit the Eurozone?
Syriza didn't really want to exit. They just wanted money. And I mean, I feel very badly for the people in Greece. I think they suffered a huge amount. I think it's important that there was a populist party to come up to challenge the old parties. It was amazing seeing how quickly the different populist parties fell into the old practices of clientelism and so on. By the way, not deep-rooted clientelism. This is fairly new. It comes after the dictatorship. But the idea was to play a game, to salvage the economy. Frankly, Greece leaves the EU, leaves the Eurozone. I mean, it's hard to say. If it leaves the Eurozone, is it going to stay in the EU? That's a big question. Where, then, is it going to find its economic home? It loses this access to a huge market. It can start trading with Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, I don't know. I don't see a huge potential there. I think that there were simply a whole lot of games going on at the time to cover over the fact that the Greek government couldn't actually realize its own reforms. I had a discussion about a year ago with a Polish economist. We were entering yet another crisis, which was yet again papered over. And he said, but you know, at a certain point, a crisis, if it keeps reoccurring, is not a crisis. It's a recurring state of affairs. It's normal practice. Right. Now, that's, I think, all being a little too cynical. The main point, though, is there are so many incentives to stay in the Eurozone that Syriza does not want to leave. Syriza is a left populist group. If you look at Golden Dawn, neo-Nazi group, sure, they'd like to leave any day.
Here's a question that I think essentially asks this. Given the vast tide of immigration that's flowing into Europe, how much of it can actually be tolerated? and European societies continue to function normally? I mean, is this something that can be handled? I mean, can democratic polities adjust to this challenge?
It depends on where you look at. I mean, the European Union is not it's a very heterogeneous club, of course, in many ways. And you need to also look at how those refugees are distributed around Europe. A country such as Germany can economically as well as socially absorb, and did absorb, a very large number of refugees without having any consequences. That might be different in some of the smaller countries that are also under economic strains. Greece is a nice example of that, because of course there are large refugee camps in Greece, and it strains the administrative control, it strains the economic and financial resources, and Greece is already under enormous pressure. So it really depends on where you look at, whether you look at a country like Germany or the UK or France or Holland, or whether you look at Greece or Portugal. Some regions in Europe are better equipped to integrate and absorb large amounts of migration, and others are less so. And this is also one of the reasons why I don't see the influx of refugees necessarily in such a negative light. The numbers are strikingly high, but historically speaking, they're not quite as enormous as they have been in the 19th century when you think about migration movements. I mean, the 19th century, half of Norway moved to the United States. It's not as though half of Syria suddenly moves to Portugal.
I can also say a couple of words on that, mostly based on what's happening in Germany. There was a fight from the 1970s on to recognize that Germany, in fact, was an immigration land, and it is an immigration land now. It has a large number of people, I don't have the numbers with me, who have come from other countries. And the fight involved recognizing that when you have a large number of immigrants, you have to be prepared for them. You have to provide language classes. You have to provide for integration. Since 1990, since unification of East and West Germany, there's been an attempt to set up new programs precisely to do that with more and more seriousness, especially after 2005. Now that's one side of the equation. The other side is political acceptance, and that it does matter. It does matter whether the people in a village want to have new people come in who speak a different language, they feel as a threat. Okay, I think that politics has to be managed as well. What I'm saying here is nothing in our discussion implies that immigration is not a problem, okay? I think that's sometimes we're accused of thinking, oh, people can come across the border anytime. That's really not a position that's the anti-right populist position. The question is how to do it, huh? And the question is also, if people are coming in, where will they fit in? Is there a place for them? Are there certain kind of jobs that can be made open? And is there a place over the long term? Now, if you look at Europe as an aging population, they are facing actually serious problems simply paying for Social Security, simply paying unemployment benefits. If people came in, even large numbers of people, and started working, could find jobs, that's the real question, can they? You start not necessarily to solve the problem, but to manage it. That's another possible way of looking at immigration as a positive thing for Europe. Are there limits? Yes, there are limits. And limits in some ways, that means that if you need to talk about how to manage the influx in a humane way, in a coherent way. I would say the only way to do that with a bunch of little countries is for them to get together and find out how to allocate people well, how to avoid problem areas, develop a common strategy. That's exactly what the EU actually tried to do.
I'll add that I think it's a practical and a philosophical question. Can Europe tolerate another million refugees, for example? And on a practical level, I support the other answers. So far, not so good. European Union and the individual nations as a whole have not responded in a coordinated, organized way to make such an accommodation possible for so many needy people. But on a philosophical level, the question is larger. It's really, is this an opportunity for the human race to do something? And although we're not all bleeding open border liberals, I think that there has so far not been enough manifestation. Of course, the EU is under so much threat to its own integrity from national challenges, but not enough manifestation of a kind of higher goal.
These answers have been, in the main, directed to the immigration problem in Europe. Would you apply the same explanations to the United States? Are we different when it comes to immigration? Can we absorb 1 million immigrants in a way that maybe Europe couldn't?
Well, I think a lot would depend on where immigrants are coming from. I mean, the United States immigration has principally been from Latin America and from Asia, and with established contacts already in the United States. That's more chain migration. That is, family reunification has been one of the principles of our immigration system. So we've had a strong capacity to both simultaneously incorporate people in terms of jobs, but also culturally and also in terms of social networks. And so we haven't had the type of friction that we've seen in Europe, and in part because you have different populations that are coming in with different types of networks already in place. Most of our networks are already here, and it's a relatively seamless effort. It's another thing, I think, from a European perspective, you have a secular humanist generally population, or at least majorities in the European countries. You're bringing people from very different societal contexts, very different environments. There may be more conflict there than we have in the United States. So I think in the United States, it's been relatively seamless, and I think by and large, pretty much every study shows that immigration has a very positive effect on the economic situation of everyone, with a partial exception of very sort of manual labor among some segments of the population, non-college educated. But by and large, for everyone else, there's a positive net gain, even though it's not always perceived that way.
Does that mean that the appeal to working class people on the basis of hostility to immigration is not rational?
Well, no, I think it was what I think Donald Trump effectively did. I think we talked about this, I think Carl mentioned this earlier, or maybe it was Christian, is that there is a problem. That is, many U.S. jobs have left. If you go to the upper Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, large factories. I used to live in Lansing, Michigan. There's a huge motor wheel factory that if you drive them from the airport, you see. That used to employ 5,000 people, UAW wages, great lives. Those jobs are gone forever, either through automation or through going to China, Mexico, and elsewhere. Immigration doesn't affect those jobs. If anything, immigration actually allows some manufacturing to stay in the United States because it does, in some areas, reduce the prevailing wage or provide higher skilled laborers through the H-1B process.
That's precisely one of the ironies. I mean, you can see that to some extent in Europe as well. The reason why there are job losses have nothing to do with immigration. They would have happened anyway, with or without immigration. It's an overall restructuring of the global economic system that leads to that. Immigration does not play a central role to this at all.
One of the issues that arise from the election is, did the American working class vote against its own interests? There are articles in the New York Times about Trump voters lining up to get Obamacare, or labor union families in Ohio voting majority for Trump, even though it's almost a certainty that the Trump administration will continue to the tendency to gut unions. Is this an example of a class voting against its own interests?
Well, I think you could look at it from a couple of perspectives. One perspective would be that Hillary Clinton's would not behave all that much differently in terms of protecting their interests than Donald Trump. That is, that in the end, she would be supporting more open borders, in terms of trade, that she would not be doing anything that's all that different from Trump. Trump's providing this promise. Now, practicality, we'll have to see what happens with Obamacare. If Trump, I think that one of the difficulties we have with Trump is, and this is going to require a lot of work, is trying to tease out his rhetoric from his actions in a way that we haven't had to do with other politicians or other leaders. That is, when he, for instance, repeal Obamacare, if he goes on a more traditional political populist perspective, he won't touch those benefits because he realizes that would alienate many of his core constituents. So while he talked about it on the campaign trail, we would actually expect to see a muddle as we move through his administration, with maybe some superficial changes, but nothing actually occurring that directly adversely affects people. Much in the same way that Republican leaders have done a bait and switch on immigration for quite some time, being very hawkish on, at least using hawkish rhetoric, but in the end, not really changing anything. That is maintaining the status quo.
Mark, if I can jump in here and ask you another question. I'm sorry to have questions keeping directed to you. It strikes me as interesting that Donald Trump didn't have policies, really. If you compare what he's saying to what Hillary said, you might not believe she's going to do them, but she had pages and pages of policies that could have helped exactly these people, but they weren't really talked about. So this gets back to the question we just heard. What would lead someone to vote for a person who doesn't actually have a policy?
Well, overwhelming.
That very seriously.
Well, an overwhelming majority of voters do not make their decisions based on policy. They make it based on combination of gut instinct, feeling, and a sort of broad identification. And one of the reasons Donald Trump won was that it was a combination of he was the Republican candidate, and so that guaranteed a certain level of vote. People were going to vote for the Republican regardless. And then he was able to convince a small share of people that he would make America great again. And if you're a working class Anglo in the upper Midwest and someone tells you that they will make America great again the way it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, those were the glory days of the upper Midwest. I mean, if you live in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, your best days are probably in the rearview mirror. And so even though he had that broad promise, that appealed to them, that gut instinct led them to follow through. And so, very few people actually think about the consequences. And the overwhelming majority also don't understand them. That is, they don't understand the linkage of Obamacare and how, if that's repealed, what Trump's policies were going to be, in part because he was somewhat amorphous about it, and then what that actual consequence would be for them. I mean, that's a pretty tight link, and that's one of the difficulties Hillary Clinton had was she was trying to explain policy. Trump was speaking in broad generalities, and that hit home with the votes he needed.
Although there is one area where there is a little bit of a policy, as it were, and that's tax policy, isn't there? And tax policy, at least if a Trump administration would follow down the route that it has promised, would certainly not favor not favor working class voters from the Midwest. On the contrary, their taxes will go up. Our taxes, us here, 5 at the table, our taxes will go down.
Well, yeah. I mean,
that is a fundamental problem, of course, that ties into the issues that Carl raised.
Well, Trump's tax policy was so unviable that no one really seriously even looked at it as being an actual policy, because in terms of the deficit it would create, it would be take Sam Brown back in Kansas and make it like 10 times worse. I don't think anybody would take that as being a serious tax policy.
One would hope so.
I don't think we should be surprised that the working class might have voted for Trump, the white working class, because he did promise to fix their plight, even if it was only in a tweet, or even if it was contradicted, or if it made no sense. But what the real paradox is to me is why the working class voted previously for Republicans. Real Republicans, not so much why they voted for Donald, because previous standard Republican rhetoric is that they want to give tax cuts to the rich. And the only explanation that I've found convincing for that other question is that the right or the Republicans promote this kind of American dream to all classes. And so if you think that your lack of social mobility is structural, which is what the Democrats might argue, then it's hopeless. But if you at least believe in the American dream, then you can find some enemies, blame it on someone else, and retain some hope for yourself.
One last question, which is actually mine, and it's a real question, Mark. Is there any data on how the white working class voted in 2012 and how it voted in 2016?
Actually, we'll get it.
Mark has the data.
It's right here. So yes. So if we do, so let's see. Romney won the working class vote over President Obama by 25% back in 2012. Trump won it by 40% in 2016. Conversely, Romney won sort of, if you go middle class to upper middle class, by 15% in 2012, and Trump won by 5%. So effectively, Trump gained among working class Anglos and lost among non-working class Anglos. So it more or less balanced out. It was just the distribution was different across the country. That is, he won those working class Anglos in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and that tipped the balance. I mean, he won Michigan by 0.2% of the vote. He won Wisconsin by 0.8% of the vote. He won Pennsylvania by 1.2% of the vote. It was a relatively small share, but that shift in the Anglo support from the people who either used to vote Democratic and switched to Trump or didn't vote in 2012 and came out to vote for Trump, that was a key flip for him. So even though Trump did poorly among college-educated Anglos, they provided the difference in the key states.
Well, I hope you agree that it was worth coming out tonight, and I would like to thank the panel. Good work, guys.